Good morning. I'm calling the Commission on School Construction and Modernization to order. I'm Senator Jennifer McClellan, and this is our first in-person meeting. So it is exciting to see you all in person. And I think we usually do the roll call, but since this is our first in-person meeting, I'll do it a little differently and ask each of the members to introduce yourselves and where you're from and who you're affiliated with. And I will start at the bottom to the right with Joe.
Good morning. My name is Joe D'Amico. I'm with the Department of General Services.
I'm Stephanie Hamlet, and I'm with the Virginia Resources Authority.
I'm Manju Ganeriwala with State Treasury.
I'm Stuart Robertson from Richmond. I'm with Mosley Architects, and I'm on the Board of Education.
Yeah, I'm Dan Gecker. I'm president of the Board of Education.
Delegate Campbell from the 24th District.
Hi, I'm Keith Perigin, Superintendent of Schools from Bristol, Virginia, and the President of the Coalition of Small and Rural Schools of Virginia.
Hello, I'm James Lane. I'm Superintendent of Public Instruction here in the Commonwealth.
I'm Jeremy McPike, State Senator from the 29th District, representing Prince William, Manassas, and Manassas Park.
I'm Delegate Shelley Simons, representing Newport News, the top half of Newport News, Virginia, and a former school board member.
Dan Timberlake, I'm the Director of the Department of Planning and Budget.
Thank you. And I believe we have some members by Zoom.
Yes, good morning, Madam Chair. It's great to see you. I'm sorry I can't be there today. This is Senator Bill Stanley. I am the neighbor of Joe D'Amico here at Smith Mountain Lake, and I represent the 20th Senate District in Southside, Virginia.
Good to have you, Senator Stanley. Anyone else by Zoom? All right. Well, we have a number of presentations today that follow up on questions asked by commission members at our last meeting. We have been in information gathering mode through our first two meetings. Now this one, really trying to scope the problem of how many schools across the Commonwealth are in need of either new construction or renovations through a wide variety of capital improvement projects, and which we received at our last meeting. And for those in the audience or watching, you can find all of the presentations from our prior meetings on our website. And today we're going to try to focus on prioritizing those needs and some things to think about in prioritizing those needs. Commission members asked a number of questions that the Department of Education will do a presentation to answer. And then we will have an overview of Virginia's debt programs, which in the past have been used to fund some school construction projects. And then we will have a discussion for what we're going to do at our December meeting. The goal here is to come up with legislative proposals, budget recommendations for the governor to be included in his budget. It's important that to the extent we want anything in his budget, we should try to begin to identify that now because that budget will be pretty close to finalized by the time of our next meeting. But that also at our next meeting will give us, if there is legislation or budget amendments we need to start thinking about at our December meeting, we will we'll vote on those and make final recommendations. So with that, we will have our first presentation on considerations for prioritizing public schools. Corey Claiborne, I think you're taking the lead on that.
Good Madam Chair and members of the esteemed commission. It's an honor on behalf of the American Institute of Architects to be before you today to share a little bit about the research and experience that we have on those questions that you posed to us and help be a resource as you shape your thoughts in developing the solutions to those same questions. My name is Corey Claiborne. Again, I'm the Executive Vice President for the American Institute of Architects. The voices that you'll hear after me will be Stephen Halsey and Rob Winstead. Stephen is a principal and K-12 education leader at Mosley Architects here in Richmond. And Rob is a principal and K-12 studio leader of VMDO in Charlottesville. I do think it's important for you to know that as we were shaping our responses to those questions, we actually reached out to a number of firms within our organization that practice in the K-12 sector. So we're just the faces, but know that the words that are coming out is a collective voice of experiences from those around the Commonwealth of Virginia in architecture in the K-12 space. When you approached us with the questions for research, I think it's important to note that this was foundational to the last part of our mission, which is improving the quality of the built environment. And so with that, we thought about, what do architects do? And as we think through that, it's our charge to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the general public through our craft, which is designing the built environment. And that even includes places that we learn. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen. He's going to provide some context and the landscape to the conversation, and then we'll go through question by question and share our experience in each one of those prompts. So with that, Stephen.
Thank you, Corey. And again, Commission, we appreciate the opportunity to be here today to just share our perspective on the K-12 landscape in the Commonwealth. And to begin with, we'll talk a little bit about some foundational information as we set the stage to answer those three questions that were provided. We'll start with four key elements. Every so often, the National Council of School Facilities publishes a document on the state of our schools, which is a nationwide kind of snapshot of the status of K-12 infrastructure across the entire country. The most recent report was issued back in January of this year, and there are four key elements that really kind of jumped off the page for us to respond to, and I think they're very applicable here in the Commonwealth. The first is regarding educational equity, and that's just not related to sort of cultural progression that we're seeing in the country right now as well, but equity in terms of having a quality starting point of facilities across jurisdictions. So that one side of a facility, of a jurisdiction or a division doesn't have substantially different facilities than other parts of that locality. And we know that providing that good quality starting point gives our children the best chance at success. Health. At any given time during the work week, 1/6 of our population is actually in K-12 buildings where the children are learning, teachers are inside, teaching and inspiring our kids, and administration going on. So it's important for those buildings to provide healthy and safe environments. So we know that access to natural light, access to outdoor natural spaces for learning, buildings that have modern HVAC systems with better filtration, provide that healthy environment for students and our teachers and staff. Sustainability is very important. Replacing modern and aging or old school facilities and modernizing those facilities. We know a number of facilities built back in the 50s and 60s are really not appropriate for renovation. They're very prone to indoor air quality issues, those sorts of things. So improving our built environment saves undeveloped land, modernizes the assets, conserves energy and water, and also reduces carbon emissions and ultimately reduces operating costs. So if we can save money in operating costs, and Rob will talk about that a little bit more in more detail, we can reinvest those monies back into education. And then finally, jobs in terms of what the construction business and the design business and K-12 does in terms of maintaining jobs and creating jobs. Throughout the course of the entire construction and design process, thousands of people interact with that process, from planning to design to production of construction documents, the construction of the building, the outfitting of that building with FF&E. Thousands of people remain employed throughout that entire process. So we know that investment in our built environment in K-12 is very important in growing the economy in terms of creating jobs. Some design considerations for each project, just to give everybody a kind of a baseline of some of the information we'll talk about later. Each project has specific program requirements. What's being taught in the school and the kind of spaces that are needed to support that instruction. Site characteristics and constraints. Much different in terms of a new locality or a locality that's looking at building a new high school on 90 greenfield acres in a suburban area compared to trying to build and locate an elementary school on 5 or 6 acres in a very congested area in urban areas. So all those program requirements and site constraints certainly impact how we fund and budget projects. So certainly budget constraints. We're here today because we're all feeling the pressures of resources and funding to improve the building inventory in K-12 and the Commonwealth. Sustainability and energy efficiency. What are the performance goals of a project? What do we want to do in terms of minimizing the impact on of the natural environment with the building? And energy and efficiency, how can we reduce energy consumption and those operational costs, and again, be able to reinvest that money back in our environment? Security is a huge consideration. We know over the past 10 or 12 years how our K-12 buildings have become targets for evil. So how can we fortify and improve the security of our schools without compromising the indoor quality and the educational environment? So the challenges that we are navigating every day. Providing barrier-free access to all of our schools, making sure that our schools are accessed for everyone who has physical challenges. And again, equity. You'll see equity show up again and again in terms of providing equity in terms of facilities within the school for those cultural issues that we're accommodating today, as well as equity of buildings across the entire jurisdiction we might be working in. Again, a baseline in terms of the school design process in Virginia, projects emerge from a capital improvement process that might be started through a large locality that might be done in-house, or smaller localities might be done through the help of outside consultants. So projects are identified and put in a capital improvement plan so we can start consideration for funding. One measure that Virginia does a very good job of in terms of trying to equalize and provide some equity of school facilities across the Commonwealth is the publication of the VDOE guidelines. Again, they're not requirements, but they're guidelines, but they give all of us a roadmap that in general, middle schools, elementary schools, high schools across the Commonwealth should generally have the same mix of spaces in terms of core spaces and space sizes, which provides that quality baseline. Every location typically has an educational specification and security protocol. So those are detailed information with ed specs about what goes into each instructional space in terms of technology, furniture, indoor air quality, those sorts of things. Once all that foundational information is started, typically projects might go through a master plan and conceptual process. So a little more detailed look in terms of what a project might be, what it might cost, and how it might solve that need in a particular locality. A design team is then selected through a qualifications-based RFP and interview process. So the design team is selected based on qualifications and how they might be a good team member in that locality. Projects have typically been delivered through a design bid build delivery system. So Rob and myself and the firms we work for typically will produce a set of documents. It will be issued for the public. Contractors can then bid on those projects, and the low bid typically ends up with the project. But we're seeing that changing quite a bit due to funding limitations, more creative delivery systems that provide a little more contractor input during the course of the process. We're seeing that happen around the Commonwealth as well. The last slide before we get into the questions is in terms of the ability to influence and impact cost happens in these foundational kind of discussions. What the project is, what are some of those foundational decisions regarding ed specs and indoor air quality and building systems. The best opportunity for all leadership in terms of a locality to influence that design process and affecting costs through good, smart design is before and during the programming phase. As we get deeper into a project, the less ability we might have to influence cost once those design decisions are made. So you can see that that kind of flow chart as we get into design development and contract documents. Those foundational decisions have been made by the design team and the locality in terms of the size of the building, the quality of the building, the types of spaces that we're going to put in a school, the systems we're selecting, the performance goals of the building. At that point, it's very little ability to really impact cost at that point of the project.
Thanks, Stephen. That's a great segue. Again, I'm Rob Winstead, VMDO Architects. Like Corey said, we're going to do our best to answer your questions the best that we can. In the interest of your time, we're going to move fairly quickly, summarize them, try and give you an answer. You'll have this PDF if you want to dig into it in greater detail. But I'd also say at the end of each of these question sections, if you have a specific question about that, that might be a good opportunity to ask that before we move on to the next question. So the first question that we were asked was, is there a methodology for determining the useful life of a newly constructed public school building, a newly renovated public school building, and then what are the factors? So the simple answer to that is there is a process, a methodology, common methodology that's used called life cycle cost assessment. That is a robust process, a rigorous process. It's not magic, it's just math in general, but there is a process typically done by specialty consultants to determine the useful life of a building or really any structure. Typically within the design services contracts that architects and engineers have, this is not a part of our services. So this is done by an outside consultant at the request of a client. Sometimes within the design process, we will do it for specific systems. So for instance, if we're making a decision between a mechanical system, right, and one system costs more in first construction costs than another system, we might do a life cycle cost assessment to show how that initial investment in the more expensive system pays off over time, that there's a return on that investment. Similarly, like a roofing system, right? A less costly roofing system might wear out 10 years earlier than a more expensive roofing system. So we might do it for specific systems as a part of our services, but typically those are done by outside consultants. Second answer to your question, for new construction, crowdsourced around firms around the Commonwealth that are working in K-12, a new building, newly constructed, we could expect to last for 40 to 50 years before there would be a need for a major reinvestment, so a major renovation of that facility. And I'll talk a little bit about how some systems might need to be replaced, certainly before that 40 to 50 year time frame. But at 40 to 50 years, we would expect a significant reinvestment. And that significant reinvestment, obviously, is a major renovation. We would expect that a major renovation to a facility would extend its lifespan for 20 to 30 years. So if you have a 100-year-old school building, it's probably gone through 2 or maybe 3 cycles of major reinvestment over its lifespan. And then breaking that down a little bit, it's a little bit deceiving to talk about kind of a whole building lifespan, because the truth is, and this diagram is trying to illustrate, buildings are made up of layers of systems, right? That the site is going to last in perpetuity, it'll last forever, right? The structure of that building, if it's made of concrete or steel, it's going to last for hundreds of years, right? But once you start getting into the building envelope, the cladding of that building, the window systems, so on and so forth, the mechanical systems that are inside the building, the interior finishes, the furniture, the equipment, those all have different lifespans, right? So the carpet, the equipment, things like that, that's going to have to be replaced long before the structure is going to need to be renovated. So there are multiple lifespans within any architectural project that have to be considered. So it's not a kind of one-time investment. There's a need for continuous investment in all of those systems if you want to maintain a high-quality learning environment. That making sense? And then answer 1D, beyond the structure or the system, there are all kinds of reasons, and I've listed a few here, we've listed a few here, that you might want to continue to invest in your facility. So Keith, we were just talking to him, small and rural districts, you might have changing demographics. Your school system is shrinking, or your school system is growing dramatically, right? You might need to accommodate those changing demographics. Changing educational programs, right? New workforce training that's required within your community, or new pedagogy or instructional strategies Dr. Lane presented on already. Security, obviously, has become a major issue. Equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. Energy, performance, and resilience. Depending on where you are in Virginia, resilience might be a really big deal, right? And also health and well-being, overall health and well-being, and COVID has really highlighted that again for all of us, right? So those are all reasons beyond the age of the structure that you might continue to invest in those facilities and change them over time. All right, I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you, Rob. Question 2, we were asked, are there any specific examples of cost savings realized by school divisions that have used replicable public school building designs to build multiple similar schools in the division? So the answer is yes. There are a number of localities in Virginia that focus on, have had some focus on using replicable designs or prototype designs. And what might work in one locality might not work in another locality. So typically, and we'll talk a little bit about building age in question number 3, we first saw in the industry prototype designs emerge in the 50s and 60s after World War II and the baby boom years. And there was, again, as Rod mentioned, it's one of those other factors, changing demographics. Huge numbers of kids being born after World War II. There was a need very quickly to build school buildings. So we've seen localities around the Commonwealth where an elementary school might have been built 8, 10, 12 times. And we're all struggling with what to do with those buildings now from an infrastructure perspective. So they really met the need in terms of just getting schools built quickly. Doesn't mean that they were great instructional environments, particularly back then. Of course, pedagogy and technology and everything that makes education wonderful today was much different back in the 50s and 60s. So again, those are specific needs to do that. Occasionally, a prototype might be adapted by another community. We don't see that often, but it does happen. And again, prototypes have kind of perhaps their place. But in terms of the answer, I guess they have been used on occasion in Virginia. Answer 2B. Prototype design, replicable design provides very limited savings in the course of the entire project. And Rob's about to show a graph that's, I think, very compelling. Typically, prototype designs can have a modest decrease in architectural engineering fees because you're not designing something from scratch. But if you start with a footprint, it may not meet the need of another locality if another locality is using a prototype design. So that prototype then needs to be modified to meet that instructional need. So that's going to be time on top. So very rarely do you see significant savings in terms of architectural engineering fees. Specifically for site design, every site is different. So in a prototype design, even though you might save a very, very limited amount in terms of architect's fees, engineer fees, civil engineering fees, those are going to be full fees because those services are really from beginning to end in terms of site design, plan and development process, site plan review, and ultimately through construction. And you might have some limited savings in a locality if a building is replicated numerous times, 3, 4, 5 times, because the more that building is repeated, the more you understand how that building goes together. So there might be a slight reduction in change orders and additional costs during the course of construction. But in general, over the course of the entire project or the lifespan of the building, prototypes really result in very limited savings.
So sometimes a picture says 1,000 words. I think people don't truly understand this idea of total cost of ownership. And so for a typical school building that is in operation for 30 years, and we just said school buildings might be in operation for 40 or 50 years to 100 years, right? So this is a modest lifespan for a school building. But for a 30-year lifespan, the vast majority of the total cost of ownership is in the operations of that building, in the utility costs, in the maintenance and operation of that building. So that's really the biggest piece of the pie. So if you're looking for savings, that's the area to focus on. As you can see, that very tiny red sliver, the architect and engineering fees that Stephen was just talking about, typically represent somewhere around 1% of the total cost of ownership. So it's a relatively modest place for you to realize significant savings. And construction and architecture together only represent about 11% of that total cost of ownership. The rest is financing, future renovations, or systems replacements that you would need to make. So all that to say that modest investments during design and construction in high quality design and construction can have a dramatic impact on that blue piece of the pie, the cost of operations, which is really where the savings lie. And let me give you an example of that. This is a pretty dense graph, but I hope that you can see it. So this is
one second. I think we have a question from Senator McPike.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to go back one real quick.
Sure.
Just for the committees, the operations costs are solely in relation to facilities in this chart. Those are not teachers.
Not
those
teacher
are not
salaries.
supportive, anything else, because typically the overall operations, the total facility portfolio cost is roughly in the single-digit percentage relative to the total staffing cost of a typical operation.
Well, in most districts that we work in, facilities operations costs are second only to salaries and compensation in terms of the budget, the school's budget. So in many districts, particularly districts that are shrinking, that have a significant number of facilities that they're still operating, facilities actually become kind of an albatross around their neck that is actually dragging them down in terms of a cost for their school system and their ability to invest in teacher salaries, programs, technology, all of the other things that we'd like to see in schools. So savings on operations costs is a big deal, and hopefully I'll illustrate that here in a second.
Senator, do you mind? If you go back, thank you. The operations number there, is that just normal operations, or does that include capital? Any capital at all? In other words, most jurisdictions ought to have some capital improvements to every building every year.
Correct. So that's that yellow, I'm trying to represent
Right.
that with
So
the yellow piece of the pie there.
So the
that
alterations is normal capital maintenance?
Correct. So roofing
what
replacement
percent of-
or interior finishes that would be replaced over time.
And major systems, HVAC, et cetera?
Major systems as well.
So what percentage of original cost would you presume per year for your maintenance line?
What percentage of
In other words,
original?
I'm in the development business.
Got it.
We know that a certain percentage ought to be reserved every year for capital maintenance and spent, frankly, every year on capital maintenance. In a school, what does that number look like?
Don't think I can answer your question. I don't have a number for that. I can tell you that for a typical high school in our region, they spend between $300,000 to $400,000 just in utility costs. And then probably double that in total maintenance costs for maintenance staff, cleaning, operations, et cetera.
General operations, I guess what I'm looking, though, is for the capital side of the equation, not the normal operational side.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer your question. We'd have to dig into that a little bit further.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So Madam Chair,
Senator McPike, although
I know we have a lot of.
we have a
other
lot of
stuff to go through.
presentations, I was hoping we could save questions for the end, but Senator McPike.
Well, it's relative, thank you, Madam Chair, it's relative to Mr. Gacker's question. And I think the real question is the total replacement value, the sort of amortized cost of your capital investment, which a lot of portfolios have anywhere between 1.4, 1.5 to 3% of the total replacement value. That is his question. And so what he's asking is, what is the typical, in your experience, you're seeing our school system is investing 2.5, 3% in order to maintain that asset's sort of life cycle value. If you allow that 20-year HVAC go out of function, it's beyond its life cycle, you're sort of extending that capital. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the relative question, is what is the relative percentage to replacement value?
It's a great question. I don't think I have a simple answer for you, so I'll be happy to dig into that and ask my colleagues and get a response to you. Stephen, you have any thoughts on that?
I don't either. I remember doing a study for a locality, and I've heard those percentages of 1.5 to 2.5% each year of that. That's a number that I've heard. But again, we haven't validated it as something that we could collectively go back and with the engineers that we work with and the facility folks we work with, our school divisions, we could dig up that number relatively quickly.
So just as one example to try and illustrate this point, in 2017, VMDO actually worked with our consultants and measured the energy use or the utility cost associated with all the schools in Arlington Public School Systems, and they're represented here on this chart. The longer the line to the right, the worse the performance. So the shorter the line, the better the performance. The longer the line, the more energy or more utility costs that they're spending. And you can see most of their buildings are, in the 40 to 60 kBTU per square foot per year. Discovery Elementary School, which was the first net zero energy elementary school in the state of Virginia, in the Commonwealth, is that tiny green line down at the bottom, and you can see the dramatic energy savings that came out of that building. And of course, we've got now 3 years of operational data from that. Discovery Elementary School costs 11 cents per square foot to operate, as opposed to $1.32 for the average Arlington public school facility. In other words, another way to describe that is you can operate 12 Discovery Elementary Schools for the cost of one average elementary school in Arlington. So that's just one example of trying to illustrate how modest investments, and I should say this building came in on time, on budget. We actually gave money back to the district, and we've been able to replicate this performance in other jurisdictions. So this is not just happening in Northern Virginia. We've got buildings that are performing in this way in Harrisonburg and other parts of the Commonwealth. It is replicable. Modest investments, smart decisions in early phases of the project have resulted in dramatic operational savings for the district. So all that to kind of wrap up the question number 2, I think there's a general consensus that prototypes are not the answer. I think they are a tool in our toolkit, and there are certain places, certainly large growing districts that are very well resourced and have a need to deliver significant facilities over a short period of time. That might be a good tool. A statewide prototypical design is not a recommendation that we would make. And that's based on research. I won't read all this to you. I'll just summarize some of it. But 25 states, according to this report from 2005, 25 states have tried a statewide prototype, and none of those states have found success with that. And they've all abandoned the idea of statewide prototypes. Like I said before, some have been successful in large school districts with ample resources, that they can result in some savings in the way that Stephen described, but that there's a lack of documentation of significant cost savings over time. And then finally, I think turning more to the positive side and back to Dr. Lane's presentation, successful schools of the future, really we know now need to apply what we know about brain research, about how students learn, about the whole child and how they grow and develop their academic performance, their health, their safety, their well-being, and self-esteem. And certainly that's a significant driver for us as architects, but also the opportunity that we have with investments in our schools. All right, turn it back over.
Thank you, Rob. I know we're getting a little pressed on time, so I'll go through question 3 pretty briefly. I think the content in 1 and 2, I think was really important to get through. So the last question was, are there specific time periods during which school construction designs, practices, materials were 1, weaker or should be prioritized for replacement, or 2, stronger and should be prioritized for renovation? Is there a correlation between economic conditions and the quality of school construction during any such period? So the simple answer, and we'll go kind of go through 4 periods of time just pretty quickly in terms of building characteristics. There are good and bad buildings in every period and of every type. So again, it kind of goes back to resources and priorities of localities at any given time during these chunks of time that we're going to look at. Typically, the first period we'll look at is a big chunk, 1900s to 1940s, coming out of the industrial revolution that resulted from the Civil War. We saw lots of advances in building technologies and materials. We saw buildings in this era constructed of a lot of high quality and durable materials, a lot of ornament, a lot of intricate brickwork, a lot of limestone trim and those kind of things. They gave these schools in these era a distinct identity for their communities, for the states or commonwealths in which they resided. And so we see a number of these buildings with historical significance. And a lot of these buildings have landed on the National Historic Registry of Historic Places. So that's a context that we need to be mindful of with localities with these kind of buildings. They might have some community importance and a need to be maintained and to remain. So they require more creative ways to look at renovating these materials. Obviously, HVAC systems were not nearly as advanced back then, so we saw building fenestration patterns on the exterior to maximize daylight and ventilation. So large operable windows, crawl spaces that kind of promoted air ventilation, airflow through the building, and heating was primarily done through either coal-fired or gas-fired boilers. So very disjointed way of conditioning a building. Because of the crawl spaces that were implemented in these buildings to promote air movement kind of through the building and up and around spaces within the building, a lot of these buildings have accessibility challenges. So there are lots of stairs, lots of grade changes within the building. So they do prove to be very difficult to renovate. And then building envelopes. Rob spent a lot of time thoughtfully talking about energy and the importance of how a building works as a system to reduce energy costs. And typically these buildings have very porous and open envelopes. We can replace roofs in these areas, we can replace windows, but we really can't replace building skin, because it's, again, it's very integral to the building. So these buildings don't have air barriers, they don't have any insulation and envelope. So they do prove challenging from an envelope perspective. During the 50s and 60s, we touched on this too, buildings were constructed rapidly for a variety of demographic reasons. They were built very cost effectively back then, so they had lots of reduced vertical footprints. There's not a lot of space above ceilings for renovation opportunities for HVAC systems. Rob and I find these schools are the biggest candidates around the Commonwealth for replacement, and we're seeing that happen around the Commonwealth in a lot of localities. A lot of these schools are campus-style schools, so they provide a lot of challenges in terms of security and how do you renovate a school that is inherently open and provide a safe and secure environment. Some of these constructional components of these buildings with tectum deck and concrete decks, they're very difficult to replace and renovate because of their porous nature and their crumbling nature. So these buildings are very challenging right now to renovate, and we're seeing them candidates for replacement. During the 70s, the biggest driver of school construction in the 70s was energy. You see a lot of these schools around the Commonwealth, there are tons of them, these kind of low concrete brick pancakes, very small windows, vertical windows, very uninspiring spaces inside the buildings. They can be renovated, and they can be difficult to renovate from an exterior skin perspective because of the way the exterior wall systems are designed, and a lot of times these buildings have unbraced walls. They require a lot of structural improvements to open up windows, to provide that access to natural light that we know has such an impact on the quality of instruction and the student experience inside the classroom. During the 80s and 90s, a lot of the buildings, in terms of systems and exterior skin systems, were improving, moving to more synthetic kind of materials, metal panels, terracotta panels, more synthetic stucco systems. We've had challenges in terms of renovating these buildings with water infiltration. So we know water getting inside the building is terrible for lots of reasons in terms of it shows that the exterior envelope has holes. So that means that the energy efficiency of that building and the performance of that building is going to be less than desirable. And also water inside a building can produce poor indoor air quality. But one thing that we did see at the beginning of toward the end of the 90s was the beginning of looking at sustainability and how buildings can perform better. So the U.S. Green Building Council established a rating system, the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Everybody knows it as LEED. Back in the early 2000s through the the 2010 through 2015, it was the primary driver for energy performance and sustainability performance in schools. And now a lot of those principles have been assimilated into building codes in ASHRAE and IBC. So we're seeing good building performance, as Rob has illustrated with the Arlington case study.
So finally, good and bad building in every period and every type. I think that this slide is just a reminder that essentially it's not so much about the time period in which the original building was constructed. In our experience, it's more about the leadership and the resources that are available for the kind of continuous investment and commitment to maintaining these facilities. So you could have a building that's 100 years old, but it's been invested in continuously. The community cares very deeply about it, and there are resources available to address the needs of that facility, and it could be operating at a very high level today. So often what we see with school buildings that are in need of replacement or dramatic renovation is they just really have not had investment in 40 years, 50 years, 60 years sometimes. And that's really when there's a need for kind of a dramatic intervention in those facilities. And then I wanted to point out that there is actually a tool that's available. I'm not sure that everyone knows about this, but a couple of years ago, House Bill 2192 was passed, and it actually calls for new public school buildings or major renovations to existing public school buildings to pursue net zero energy performance, right? Based on a standard, achieving net zero energy, the Advanced Energy Design Guide for K-12 school buildings. So there's a tool that you all have available to help achieve better quality through new construction and major renovations. I don't think many people know this even exists. I don't think it's necessarily a funded mandate because we know most of our schools are funded locally in Virginia. And so, the design fees or the construction costs associated with this bill, remain a challenge for localities that are under-resourced. And then also, there's no real accountability for this. So I don't think that it's happening broadly across the Commonwealth, but it is a tool that's available for you. And kind of going back to that, reinforcing that message, every dollar that is saved in operations in that blue piece of the pie that we showed you is a dollar that can go to meet other needs, whether that's teacher salaries, student programs, technology, et cetera, things that we'd like to spend our money on. I'm going to pass it off to Corey to wrap us up.
Well, thank you. And I know we've tried to cover a lot of ground as quickly as we could in a short amount of time while being respectful to your agenda. So here are the key takeaways that we think we want to leave you with here. Regarding question number one, it's really a function of planning for investing in the systems piece opposed to the building as a whole. I think that's important. There's many layers to the building. And there's also other reasons to invest outside of the physical plant. One example that I've heard of recently is a playground, for example. If it was done a long time ago, it's probably created for able-bodied children. But now folks are starting to reinvest in playgrounds, as an example, for all bodied children. Might be one example from an equity standpoint that you would look at. Prototypes it is a tool in the belt that we have here, but we don't believe it is the answer. But it certainly are circumstances where it certainly could be applicable. And then we also saw, as we studied buildings across the general spectrum of the decades, 1900s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and so forth, what we started to see was a correlation more about the resources that are invested in the maintenance and operations, more so than the building itself, right? We've seen good and bad buildings in each of those decades. And then lastly, what we hope you take away from that pie chart is as we think through how we might prioritize our funds, it's the operations at the end of the day. It's making up a half of the pie. No matter what you spend up front, if we have that as the end goal, I think you will see a major return on your investment. And so with that, we'll bring this to a close and happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Are there any questions from commission members? Yes.
Madam
Mr.
Chair, I'd like to make 2 quick points and then ask a quick question. Number one, I think that, gentlemen, you did a great job of bringing attention to what we saw as we did Crumbling Schools tours in every region of the Commonwealth this summer. The way you described concerns with buildings built in the 1900s, the 40s, the 50s is exactly what we saw across the Commonwealth of Virginia when we had Crumbling Schools tour. Also, it seems to be that the only guarantee that students in high poverty school divisions have for equitable school construction or school facilities is the guidelines for new construction and modernization. However, if school divisions and localities don't have the capacity to do renovations or constructions, there's no guarantee of equity. And then finally, the question that I have is this. With Discovery Elementary, what is the cost difference per square foot for construction?
There's no cost difference per square foot. And I would argue that high-performance buildings are not so much a cost issue as they are a priorities issue, right? Establishing those goals and criteria for the project early on in the process. And I think that's really what House Bill 2192 is trying to do. It's saying this is an expectation for schools in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I think that's the biggest issue. Like I said, that project actually came in under budget, and it actually costs less per square foot than other more conventional schools that were built in the district over the same period.
Both for construction and for operations?
Correct.
Thanks.
Sorry. It's significant savings in operation, but no additional cost in construction.
Dr. Robertson?
Thank you, Senator. I just quickly want to say thank you to the team presenting. It was my pleasure to interact with them in advance of today's presentation, and I know the commission is very honored to have here among Virginia's top school design professionals. And thank you for featuring them.
Thanks.
Thank you, team.
Thank you. Any further questions? Thank you all for your presentation. That was very helpful, especially to, I think, debunk a couple of myths that at least I had, and I think some other commission members might have had, particularly You hear often that it may be the period a school was built may have more to do with whether it needs to be renovated or replaced, and that certain time periods might fare better than others. That appears maybe it's true for the 50s and 60s, which is not surprising, but definitely is helpful to hear that there are other factors we need to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
All right, so next we have Dr. Lane will provide answers to a series of questions Commission had at our last meeting.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning again. If we can go to the next slide, there were a series of questions proposed by the commission there is a clicker, thank you. There were a series of questions proposed by the commission last month. Several answers were just given by our architects, but after discussing it with legislative staff, these are the 5 areas the Department of Ed focused on to support your questions since the last commission meeting. The first question is, what are the total renovation and new construction needs in specific superintendent regions? So we went about that a couple ways here. The first that we did, we're showing you here what is currently in approved capital improvement plans in each of the regions. And so you can see that in Central Virginia, there are 17 new school construction projects. Typically, capital improvement plans are within a 5 to 7 year period. Some go as long as 20 and some are as short as 1 year, but most are about a 5-year capital improvement plan. So this is the number of schools that we think will be built in each of these regions or starting to be built in the next 5 or so years. You'll note very few schools in, say, Region 6 and Region 7. That does not mean that there aren't needs in those areas. That means that there's no available funding for them to actually launch projects in the next 5 years. We gave you a number last month that showed you essentially how many buildings in each of these communities were older than a certain number of years, and that's probably a better picture of what the actual need is around the Commonwealth than just what's in the CIP plans. But a lot of those schools, and I think we heard this in the last presentation, could be candidates for renovation. Just real quick, what I wanted to show you is because there were no schools shown in the 5-year CIP plans, or only 2 schools shown in the 5-year CIP plans older than 50 years, if we looked at just the schools older than 50 years in Region 6 and Region 7, you can see that there's, couple hundred schools that would be candidates for some conversation around renovation and construction in those regions. So I wouldn't want to ignore need just looking at what's in CIPs. But this was the point that I was just starting to make, and that is that I wanted to show you that school divisions are thinking about the fact that maybe they cannot afford to completely newly construct schools, or they recognize that their buildings are great candidates for renovation. And so this is, based on approved division CIPs, how much is in the CIP to focus on school renovation. And you'll see millions and millions of dollars there. And we broke that out by region because that was the request. We provided you more aggregate numbers the last time that we got together. Just as a reminder, we put an asterisk at the bottom of the slide. Divisions did self-report nearly $3 billion in planned renovations at 325 different schools that were not actually in their CIPs. So what that means is there's $3 billion more need than they think they can afford even in the next 5 years.
Dr. Lane, for that amount, if it's not in your presentation, could you get us a breakdown by division?
Of the 325
Yes.
not reported, yes, we'll do that for you.
Thank you.
So then the next question that the commission asked was, okay, if there's a limited pool of resources, essentially where would you spend your money? So as you know, in the last time that we got together, We surveyed our school divisions. We also reviewed every CIP plan that we could get our hands on. And so you'll see what this looks like in the coming slides. So statewide, school divisions clearly ranked HVAC projects as their top priority. And then you'll see from there it goes down. HVAC was by far the thing that they needed the most. That might partly be based on the crisis, the pandemic crisis, making it a higher priority. But then you can see the nearly $3 billion in renovations. Then it goes to roof repair, safety and security, electrical and plumbing, school additions. And then you see new facilities is actually ranked 8th. Again, I would, the question that was asked here is where would you rank it with a limited pool of resources? With a limited pool of resources, they would not say that school construction would be top priority. But if there were more resources from the state or the federal government, I think you'd see new schools rise higher and higher up this list. And then there are grounds and parking lots and other matters. But obviously HVAC, renovations, roof repair, those are the major needs in schools right now. And then, of course, since the last time we got together, the governor and the General Assembly have announced $250 million in grants to begin to address some of these needs, which have to be matched 50-50. And so if you assume that there's $600 million in need, as shown on the slide, $500 million has been made available in the last 6 months. I just wanted to show a quick slide of where all the regions were. So as we go through some of these questions and you're thinking about, well, where is that school division? Essentially, Region 1 is here and on down into past Petersburg. Region 2 is Hampton Roads. Region 3 is Middle Peninsula and Northern Neck. Region 4 is Nova. Region 5 is Charlottesville and Harrisonburg area. Region 6 is Roanoke on into Martinsville. Region 7 is the further Southwest Virginia, essentially past Roanoke all the way to the Tennessee border and, with Kentucky. So again, you asked us not only to show you generally what the priorities were, what were the priorities by region? And so you can see, again, in Region 1, which is the Central Virginia, Richmond area, HVAC and roof repair, the top 2, new schools being number 3. In Region 2, Tidewater, again, HVAC, renovation, roof repair, similar themes across all of the regions. Northern Neck, HVAC, renovations. Here, maybe they're, especially the western side of Region 3, which is what I would call Fredericksburg, Stafford, they're actually growing with number of students. So you see a unique characteristic in Region 3 that school additions is high on the list. That's not, I would say, consistent across all of Region 3, but that I-95 corridor that cuts through Region 3 is seeing a significant growth in students. Northern Virginia, again, renovations, updating buildings, HVAC, roof repair there. In Northern Virginia, we're actually seeing a lot of new school construction going on, generally speaking, compared to other regions. In the Valley, renovations again, so again, older buildings, HVAC, school additions, you do have some growth in certain pockets of the Valley. And then technology upgrades actually popped up higher on their list. Region 6, again, this is kind of Roanoke to Martinsville. HVAC, again, roof repair, renovations, and then the same thing. Southwest actually had renovations at the top. I think that you're seeing that we can do as much HVAC and roof repair as we want. Some of these schools and their systems are so old in Region 7, it's no longer really feasible and viable to continue renovating a building envelope that's pretty much gotten ineffective. And then, you know, in a lot of cases, there was not operations money in Region 7 to maintain those buildings over those times periods as well. So significant needs there. As an example of HVAC repair, I visited Floyd County, and they still use coal-fired heaters in the building. And so in the winter, you can smell the coal as you walk through the school. Pretty major needs in some of those areas. South Side, again, renovations, a lot of older facilities there. I visited Buckingham County. that was one of those schools where the cornerstone on the building was thanking the Federal Works Program for the construction of the building. A lot of schools in Region 8 built during the Federal Works Program.
Dr. Lane, before you leave question number 4, you mentioned the total amount of grants authorized by the General Assembly. I think some portion, if not all of those grants, I need you to help refresh my memory, were specifically targeted to HVAC repair and replacement. Do you recall that amount?
The entire $250 million grant is able to be spent on HVAC and is intended for HVAC. Of course, because that's a 50-50 match grant with the localities, that's where the total $500 million should be going to solve some of these nearly $600 million in needs. I think that was a huge step forward for us.
Well, and I guess that's my question. I want to make sure everybody's on the same page and is clear. So of all of the categories and costs listed here, the half from the General Assembly is limited to HVAC repair and
That's
replacement.
right.
Is the match limited to HVAC, or can the match be used for anything?
HVAC is for the entire $500 million.
And then follow-up question, and you may not be able to answer this. Does that cover all of the HVAC needs that have currently been identified?
It covers all of the needs that are in approved CIPs.
Okay.
Keep in mind that when CIPs are approved, the school divisions may not have felt like there were viable resources to go beyond that.
Okay.
But it at least covers what it covers 5/6 of what they said they were going to be able to do in the next 5 years.
So earlier when I asked you if you could give us a breakdown of the $3 billion in planned renovations that were not approved, if by region, if you could also give us that by category, that'd be helpful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, just one point about the HVAC. There was an allocation formula that was directed by the legislation, so it might be helpful for you to see how the allocation matches
Yes.
the need, because it's not necessarily that you've covered 5/6 of it across the board, because it may have covered 100% in some and not as much in others if the formula didn't match the need according to this.
That's a fair point that Mr. Timberlake makes. The way that money was rolled out was by formula. So theoretically, there could be school divisions whose individual CIPs had more need than was provided by the formula, and maybe other school divisions who had less need than was provided by the formula, but were able to get into other projects that had not been in their 5-year CIP. But I will say, having reviewed a lot of those applications coming in ARP plans, I don't think that you're going to see a lot of school divisions leaving any money on the table. It's going to address a lot of need.
Madam Chair, to that point too, if I may,
Yes.
that was a per pupil amount that was distributed. It wasn't based on poverty or need. And so but I will also say that with CARES funding, ESSER 2 funding, and ESSER 3 funding, which could all three be used for HVAC, I think that the school divisions do have ample opportunities to address HVAC. What we don't have is the flexibility to address those other needs that we don't have the local capacity to address.
And that's why I asked that question, because I think it's helpful to put in context, while the number one need identified by each region, 1 or 2, was HVAC, that might not be the best place going forward for the General Assembly to focus its attention. I think what all of this data and what I've asked for is going to show is there are other categories that we might want to focus our attention going forward. Yes.
I have a comment along those lines. In Newport News, we have a lot of 1950s and 60s buildings that we have done a good job keeping up the HVAC systems and have them on a rotation with roofs and everything. But we still have the fundamental issue that the architects talked about before around security and the campus design of the building, and ADA designs for some problems for some of our 1940s buildings. So we have in our area been able to maintain them, but we still have those fundamental design flaws with the buildings that need to change. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And just one clarification I'll provide. I know Dr. Perigin brought this up, but the ARP funds, which is the largest amount of funding that we sent down to school divisions, nearly $2 billion, can be used for more broad capital projects. But I will say we're having a lot of conversations between the Department of Education and localities about making sure that they've reserved enough money to address student learning loss. And so there are a lot of priorities for those funds. And I would not think of the one-time federal funds we have as a long-term solution for the many needs that school divisions have. But to your point, Senator McClellan, I do think that you've addressed a significant amount of the HVAC need and would agree that the focus moving forward should be on broader flexibility and broader projects. And I think the data shows that here. Okay, the next question that the commission asked was information on how school divisions are jointly using facilities, maybe in adjacent divisions, and how any of this consolidation might promote efficiencies. First and foremost, other than through regional schools, this is actually quite rarely done. So the most popular joint use of facilities projects that we see are governor schools and our regional CTE programs. There are some other specialty programs, Code RVA being an example that the General Assembly may be aware of, that jointly use facilities. But those are the two most popular, regional CTE programs and governor schools. When we talked to school divisions about this, a number of factors came up in why this is not as attractive. Geography and distance become an issue, which results in transportation costs, different facilities needs, competing facility needs that may impede joint use facilities. And frankly, what students will tell us is, governor schools and regional CTE programs aside, traveling those far distances for your general education that can pretty much otherwise be provided at the home school, it is not as attractive to a lot of students. But consolidation does have benefits. It does reduce maintenance costs. It does reduce utility costs. It can reduce some staffing costs with shared opportunities. Even though there are potential resulting transportation costs from the locality, you can consolidate some routes and possibly look at some cost savings there. Consolidation resulting in a new facility can often lead to safer, healthier, and more desirable environments because they'll be more modernized through the joint efforts and funding. Again, we see a lot of success in our regional programs, but generally speaking, for a general education experience, most parents want to be able to have their school as close to the neighborhood as possible. So then the next question was more on this, this notion that the AIA just talked about, which was prototype designs and so on and so forth. I won't go into a lot of that, but one of the things that I don't know that they went into is how much cost savings there would be. They put great caveats on that. Some of the examples of the caveats were that there can end up being very little to no cost savings if you modify the prototype over and over again. But generally speaking, you can see somewhere in the ballpark of 5%, plus or minus 5% in construction costs with this approach. I have personal experience with that in Chesterfield. The savings was really on the A&E side. I'll ask you not to quote me on this, but I feel like I remember when we were budgeting A&E, we were budgeting somewhere between 7 and 10 million, and when we went with a prototype design, we ended up spending about 5 to 6 million. So a couple $1 million in savings per building by using a prototype design, which is why I think the AIA partners just presented, you really have to be in a locality where you're building multiple buildings for that really to be relevant for you. And when you get to different geographies and different regions, using a state prototype is probably not going to lead to those same savings because of the conditions that you see in the mountains versus flatlands of, say, as you get further east. And then I think this is the final question. If you could, we were asked to identify, to essentially take the DOE's basic standardized school format that's in the guidelines that were referenced, come up with an approximate square footage and an approximate cost per square foot to see, not building a Taj Mahal, as it is said, but building a basic school, what would it cost? And so we had to make some decisions. So we based it on a 600-student elementary school, an 800-student middle school, and a 1,200-student high school. I say that as a caveat because there are some school divisions where if the school they're building, it's the only high school in the community, isn't 2,400 students, they're not going to be able to build 2 high schools. Obviously, we don't necessarily recommend a school be as large as 2,400, but using 600, 800, and 1,200 as a projection, if you go with just the very basic minimum standard classroom sizes and everything else, that's about a 48,000 square foot elementary school, 93,000 square foot middle school, 122,000 square foot high school. And then when you look at what that costs per square foot, and again, this is minimum instructional spaces, minimum administrative space, minimum size media center, does not include a large performance auditorium, which is obviously a huge expense, does not include the varsity sized, full gym that you would expect. So again, minimum requirements, you come in at square footage costs of $275 at the elementary, $290 at middle, $340 at high school. I would be careful to use, because obviously the next thing you're going to do is multiply the square footage by the square foot cost. I would be careful, and it's one of the reasons we didn't put it on the slide. I'd be really careful to use that number as what it actually costs. So for instance, in elementary, you multiply 48,000 times 275 a square foot, I think it comes out to about $13 million. I can tell you I have not seen a school built for $13 million. That doesn't include furnishings. That doesn't include A&E. It doesn't include any modifications that you make to the facility. It does not include any of the upgrades that a school division may want to do with some of the elements in the building. It doesn't include, say, terrazzo floors versus tile. The tile's harder to maintain, so you end up spending more on tile over time. There's a lot that goes into that, but we wanted to answer the question that was asked, so we have done so. The other thing that it doesn't do is it does not make any assumptions around what the actual need in the number of students in a building is. 600 is a very good-sized elementary school, but a lot of the need in many communities leads schools to build schools as much as 50% larger than that, and that obviously would significantly increase the cost. So with all of those caveats, here is the standard cost at the square footage for the very basic school envelope. And with that, I can answer any more questions.
Dr. Robertson.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. Dr. Lane and his team have really done a wonderful job of providing us comprehensive information from the beginning of the commission's work. Thank you again. If we could go back to that last slide, if it's possible to pull it up. I just want to give a little more oomph beyond what Dr. Lane did. He teed it up appropriately, but these are stripped down numbers. I don't think we should hang our hat on this as a standard going forward. However, I know that some school systems would be pleased to have a new school. And if they had a new school in this stripped down nature, some may be pleased to have it. In my 21 years as a superintendent, presided over the design and construction of dozens of schools, and I can tell you I've never seen a high school of 122,000 square feet. They typically started at 250,000 square feet and went further than that. So I just wanted to offer that color so that I could reinforce what Dr. Lane was saying, that these are very minimal numbers, and I would caution the commission to not accept them as a template for what we may want to have for our discussions going forward. Perhaps a starting point, but we would need to certainly grow from there to be reflective of what we do know the local community's expectations may be. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments? All right, thank you, Dr. Lang. And if, because our next meeting is not until December and we'll be making some decisions by then, that additional breakdown, if you could send that to the full commission between now and the next meeting, that would be helpful.
We'll get it in the next couple weeks to Ryan, and we'll get it out to everybody. But yes, we would appreciate it if we could just do a written report on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and then our final presentation is on a review of the Commonwealth's debt programs.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chairman and members of the Commission. In interest of time, I will quickly walk you through and provide you a high-level overview of the different types of debt and the debt issuing authorities the Commonwealth has. And then we'll jump into the Virginia Public School Authority and Literary Fund, take a deeper dive into VPSA. My colleague, Jay Mahone, who's Public Finance Manager with Virginia Treasury, is going to do those last two sections. Okay, so Department of Treasury has 5 very distinct programs. Debt management and issuing Commonwealth's debt is one of them. And that division is headed by Brad Jones, who's also in the audience there. The division is responsible for issuing and monitoring all the debt of the Commonwealth, the tax-supported debt. And it's the debt that's issued by following authorities and boards. Treasury Board is a board under Treasury, meets monthly. It's responsible for issuing all the general obligation debt and also authorizing leasing programs for the Commonwealth. Other authorities that have issued debt in the Commonwealth are Virginia College Building Authority, issues debt for all the higher education needs, construction. Virginia Public Building Authorities for government in general when we are building state buildings, office buildings, forensic labs, those kinds of debts are issued by VPBA. And then VPSA is the authority that issues financings for school divisions. The debt division also is responsible for modeling Commonwealth's debt capacity. I'll talk a little more detail later about that, and then also maintaining rating agency relations. So the framework for issuing debt is laid out in the Constitution. Article 10, Section 9 of the Constitution of Virginia provides the constitutional provisions under which state can issue debt. And the debt that states can issue can generally be divided in 2 major categories. One is general obligation debt, and the other is non-general obligation debt. So this table here, it's a little busy, but provides you that framework. So the first 3 sections, these are sections under Article 10 of the Constitution, Section 9A, 9B, 9C. Those are all general obligation debt. If you look at the security column there, it says GO. It means that the state is providing its full faith and credit in payment for the debt. Section 9D debt is not considered general obligation debt, and that is primarily the appropriation-backed debt that General Assembly approves each year through the budget process. 9A debt can be issued for emergencies, insurrections, deficits, and redeem prior obligations. Virginia hasn't resorted to 9A debt in quite a while. We don't even currently have records. We'd have to do more in-depth research. But the staff remembers that maybe perhaps in early 80s there was a redeeming done, refunding done for some toll road project that we may have used 9A debt. Another example would have been last year, as a result of the pandemic, many states postponed their tax due dates, tax collection dates beyond their fiscal years. Virginia did not do that. We extended it, but we kept it within the fiscal year. But for those states that did postpone it beyond their fiscal year, then, some of them had problems with cash flow and had to borrow in anticipation of revenue coming in later. And if we were in that position and if we had to borrow, then the General Assembly would be authorizing issuance of 9A debt. 9B debt is your generally what we refer to as the voter-approved general obligation debt, where the General Assembly authorizes this debt, has to be then put before the voters, and once it's approved, then it can move forward. 9C debt is also general obligation, but does not go for voter approval. However, the Constitution then places a higher bar for the legislature to approve that debt because it is still pledging full faith and credit of the Commonwealth. And that's why you'll see that that debt requires a two-thirds majority approval by each house of the legislature. You often, there's annually a bill before you, it's called the 9C bond bill that both House and Senate have to approve. That's the 9C general obligation bill that you see. And then majority of the debt issued by the Commonwealth in the last 20 years has been the 9D debt, which is non-general obligation debt. The last time there was a 9B debt was in 2002, a voter referendum. Prior to that, it was 1992. So you see, for 20 years, the Commonwealth has not issued a 9B voter-approved debt. This is an issue that rating agencies often, bring up during our annual meetings with them and periodic meetings with them, that Virginia really has become very lopsided in just issuing most of its debt, appropriation-backed debt, rather than going to the voters.
Senator McPike has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What are the financial costs in terms of basis points between the difference when you're dealing with rating agencies between a 9B, a 9C, and a 9D? I presume they are treating them somewhat differently, right? So there's a cost with each choice and each policy choice through that chart.
Sure. So the bond market has been so strong and favorable for last 8 or 10 years. So the current cost difference is probably not as much as what we would have seen back in 2007, 2008 timeframe. But I would say one thing I should mention is the AAA rating the state has on its debt applies to the general obligation debt. So 9A, B, and C bonds would be AAA rated. 9D debt does not get general obligation because it doesn't have the full faith and credit pledge. It's a notch below, so it's AA rated bonds. The difference in current market would probably be 20 basis points, 15. It could range from 20 to 30 basis points, I would say. But, when we go into inflationary years and the interest rates rise, that difference could very well be 70 to 80 basis points or 100 basis points. But right now, it's lower, but there's still a difference. Again, I think I covered a lot of the points I made. Wrote down here about authorization by General Assembly, AAA rated for 9B debt, 9C debt, two-thirds vote of the General Assembly. But it's backed by two streams of revenues from the project, but also Commonwealth's general pledge if the project revenue happens to not be sufficient. And sometimes you hear the bond term called double-barreled bonds. That just means it has two streams of revenue supporting the debt service of those bonds. And again, because there is full faith and credit pledged here, the governor, for 9C bonds, the governor has to certify that the revenues from the project will be sufficient to meet both principal and interest payments of that debt service. 9D debt, again, majority of debt issued by the state has been in this category. It's issued under the VCBA, Virginia College Building Authority 21st Century Program, which means where the General Assembly has provided general fund debt service payments for those higher education projects. And those generally are instructional related, if it's a school of medicine or new law school or a library. The General Assembly often provides general fund debt service for that. And also the Virginia Public Building Authority debt, again, all DGS managed projects for state buildings, the renovation of the Capitol, all those were VPBA bonds. There's another type of higher education debt that's issued under the VCBA, which is not funded through general fund appropriation, but each institution can, use its own revenue, general revenues of higher education institution to fund those projects. Just an overview of the outstanding tax-supported outstanding debt. This does not include other long-term obligations and pension obligations, which would probably double this number if I included. So this is basically tax-supported bonded debt outstanding. As you could see, that number has increased over the years from somewhere in $8.5 billion to a little over $11 billion. So it's been steadily going up. Now, issuing bonds and debt, most states look at debt capacity. And the way the debt capacity is determined, that each state adopts some sort of a measure on, what is prudent to issue in any given year. What should be our threshold that we should not cross. And Virginia has adopted a threshold that, it's adopted by policy, it's not codified, that our debt service payments in any one given year would not be over 5% of our revenue, looking at it in terms over a 10-year horizon. So it's generally speaking, if your revenue is $100 million, you would not want to have your debt service be more than $5 million in any given year. So there is a debt capacity advisory committee that's established in the code in the early 80s. The committee's job or its mandate is to advise the governor and the General Assembly on the amount of debt that can be prudently authorized and issued in the budget that the General Assembly is considering, usually the biennial budget and one other year. So usually the committee makes recommendations for 3 years. The committee's December 20 recommendations were an additional $544 million could be authorized and issued during fiscal year 21 and 22. Again, the committee urged the Governor and General Assembly to consider implications of future rise in interest rates. We keep waiting when that curve will turn. It hasn't yet. This has been the longest period of low interest rates that we have seen in modern times. And also consider the committee's recommendation was, to be very cautious whether new debt authorizations are necessary at this time. And the reason for that was there's already on the books, say, over $6 billion in debt that has been authorized in prior years by the legislature that has yet to be issued. So if we have such a huge backlog in the pipeline, the recommendation from the committee was, we really need to be cautious to see if we need to add more to the pipeline. With that, I'm going to call my colleague here. I'm happy to take questions now or questions later.
Senator McPike.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A question in regards to, I'm sure that as part of the debt management, you guys have sort of reissued older bonds at lower rates through sort of cash and capital management process, and as well as there's probably some bond proceeds involved, and how do you manage those?
So I'll repeat the question to make sure I understood correctly. So the first part of the question was, do we do refunding to kind of capture savings? Yes, our staff is constantly looking at refunding opportunities. And with such low interest rate environment, and, if you might remember, prior to pandemic, when the Federal Reserve was raising interest rates, the rates started to rise. So bonds that were issued a few years ago, and then Fed stopped doing that, and the rates went back down again during the pandemic, presented opportunities to refund bonds that had been recently issued 3, 4, 5 years ago. So we are constantly capitalizing on those opportunities. Senator McPike, would you repeat the second part of your question, please?
That's fine, thank you.
Okay,
We have-
thank you.
Delegate Simons.
I have a question for you. So the debt overview slide for 9D debt, so we have the two different types there, higher education debt, and then the first was the appropriation-backed debt. I wasn't really clear on the difference. I see that there's higher education included kind of in both. Can you describe, what the difference would be? And for example, if it was an academic building for instruction versus a dormitory where clearly the university would get revenue to pay for the dorm, but what about the academic buildings where there isn't quite as clear a connection for the revenue?
All right, so the first category of 9D, which is appropriation-backed debt, and we talk about the Virginia College Building Authority 21st Century Program. Projects authorized under that program are generally funded through general fund appropriation, and they have very strong nexus to instruction. It's new college for chemistry or library, School of Medicine. The 9D, higher education debt, the second category of 9D debt, there is no general fund appropriation provided there. And those usually are projects where there may be revenue, but there may not be. It's just that university is pledging its general appropriation that's available to it. It could be appropriation that the General Assembly has provided. It could be revenues from other sources, tuition and fees. And examples there would be, you talked about dorms. Dorm and dining projects usually qualify to be funded as GO bonds, so they are funded as 9C debt because the university can get much cheaper rate for those. But this would be like athletic facilities, if a university is building an arena or a gym or some athletic facility that doesn't have a defined revenue stream that would be, they would be able to pay debt service with, then they would use this kind of a bond. Did that answer your question? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the commission. I want to talk to you a little more in depth on the Virginia Public School Authority and also the Literary Fund, and in general about the financing opportunities available to schools for their capital projects. Just to open with the Virginia Public School Authority, created in 1950 under the Code of Virginia, governed by an 8-member Board of Commissioners, 3 ex officio members, 2 of which serve on this commission as well, State Treasurer, Superintendent of Public Instruction. State Comptroller is also a member, and there are 5 citizen members appointed by the governor. They serve 6-year terms, and those terms are staggered, so generally each governor gets 1 or 2 appointments during their term. 2 major goals for VPSA, and the second one is really just in service to the first, and that's to provide efficient market access and low-cost financing to Virginia local governments and their public school divisions. Also to maintain high credit ratings to ensure the lowest possible cost of funds. So as we all know, facilities and that sort of thing for schools in Virginia has traditionally been left at the local level. Local school divisions have the responsibility for their buildings, for maintaining them, for operating them, and so forth. Unlike in some states, school divisions in Virginia do not have taxing power or the ability to issue debt. For that reason, they will work with their local government for these financing options. Several approaches they can take, you see listed here. First, we have cash. We all wish we had that. So I'll go to the second one, bank loans. These can be a very good option for a school to finance a project. They sort of wax and wane in popularity. First half of the last decade, quite a bit of that. Second half, not so much. Rates can be good on those. Limitations include perhaps the amount that can be borrowed and the length of the term that it can be borrowed. So a good option, but not a perfect option. Next, you see a series of different types of bonds listed there.
Excuse me, Senator McPike had a question, I think,
sorry?
on the loans.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm trying to limit these, but I think this is important distinction. Why are bank loans an option? Is there an issue with coordination with localities and issuance of debt? And there's also a difference between localities that can issue debt without referendum and those who cannot. Can you explore the funding mechanisms and how that influences what financing options are available?
I can. I'll do that over the course of these next couple of items if you don't mind. And if I don't cover exactly what you're looking for, by all means, stop me. But type of bonds listed there, the first is general obligation bonds. These are issued directly by the locality, similar to what the treasurer described for the Commonwealth's GO bonds, in that they contain a pledge of the full faith and credit of the locality for their repayment. Generally lowest interest cost on this type of bond because of that pledge behind it. In Virginia, if you are a county to issue general obligation debt, you need to have a referendum. If you're a city, you do not, although there are some other restrictions related to the amount of outstanding debt for a city. Second item listed there, subject to appropriation bonds. You may hear those called lease revenue bonds or something like that at times. But again, the difference being it's not a pledge of the full faith and credit. It is requires an annual appropriation from the local government. To highlight those differences, again, GO bonds issued directly by the locality, subject to appropriation bonds issued through a conduit, like an economic development authority or an industrial development authority. GO bonds do, in the case of a county, require a referendum. Lease revenue subject to appropriation bonds do not require a referendum, again, because they do not carry that full pledge. And the next options there, which I'm going to go to in more detail, are the BPSA and the Literary Fund. Now, I make a similar presentation like this to local governments, local school folks, and what I tell them is of those options listed there, there is not a right answer. There's not a wrong answer. They all have their benefits and they may have limitations. So what you have to do is determine the best of those options for your locality, for the project at hand at this particular point in time. You see there that things that may influence that cost. Where's the lowest interest rate to be found right now? Availability. Can you get a bank loan or a bank loan of sufficient size for your project? These are the things you have to take into consideration, and any of those options could be the right answer. Senator, any follow-up? So getting into the VPSA, our pooled bond program, we call it the flagship of the group. First issued bonds under this program in 1962. Again, the idea of providing low-cost financing to schools for their capital projects. I would encourage you to remember those words low-cost financing as I get to the end of this presentation. In very simple terms, which I'll detail a little further, VPSA directly purchases a general obligation bond from a locality. Rather than them going out and selling it on the market to an underwriter, they sell it directly to VPSA. VPSA makes this purchase through the issuance of our own bonds. I'll get into that process a little more, but just a couple of key facts for you there. The current bond resolution, which VPSA issues under, has been in place since 1997. 68 series of bonds under that resolution. It's been tweaked a little bit, but for the most part, for the past nearly 25 years, it has worked well. We have AA1, AA plus ratings from the rating agencies. Again, going back to the Treasurer's presentation, does not carry the full faith and credit of the Commonwealth behind it, so it's not a AAA, it's one notch below. Right now, there are about $2.3 billion in bonds outstanding under the pooled bond program, and that's for 98 localities in Virginia who have bonds outstanding under the program. I've seen that number as high as 106, I think, in my time here. 98 currently, and that's 98 out of 132 school divisions, so nearly 75%. We typically issue bonds twice a year in the spring and fall. That seems to work best for the school divisions, providing the funds to them at the time of year when they need it. So what's in it for the localities? As I mentioned, they do make a local general obligation pledge to VPSA, and as I said, there's a referendum required for GO pledges, with one exception. The Code of Virginia has a carve-out for GO bonds issued directly to VPSA. So for a county, there is not a referendum requirement in this case. At the time of issuance, there are no out-of-pocket costs to the localities, with one exception. We do require an opinion of council. That basically says that local GO bond was properly issued. So not a full legal opinion like we might have in some cases. No rating agency fees, which is generally the highest portion of cost of issuance of most any bonds. No economic development authority fees, for example, if they were issuing the lease revenue bonds through an EDA, which may have a fee for that service. So that is not involved with VPSA. We get very favorable interest rates with our high ratings. This past spring, if you were borrowing for 20 years, we sold bonds in April, and the rate was about 1.81%. We also offer flexible terms for the repayment. Code limits us to 30 years on the long end, no limit on the short end, although if you go very short, inside 10, maybe inside 5 years, we might not be the most cost efficient. That might be where the bank loan is a good option for you. But we can structure the repayment in a way that works best for the locality. We can finance all types of projects so long as they're school related. That means land, buildings, and equipment. We're doing some school buses right now. So lots of different options there. And to a point I heard mentioned earlier, whenever the market is favorable for us, we do refinance the VPSA bonds. All savings realized from these refinancings are returned to the localities. VPSA does not keep anything. So for the past 10 plus years, it's about $144 million that's been returned to the localities who were participating in those refinanced issues. So we are a bond bank, and the way we work, again, a locality will sell its general obligation bond to VPSA. I have a very simple example up here. If we had 5 localities that wanted to borrow $10 million each for their projects, they would each sell their $10 million GO bond directly to VPSA. VPSA would be the owner. Concurrently with this, VPSA will issue its own bond on the competitive market for $50 million, and that will be purchased by an underwriter on behalf of investors. When this process closes, the underwriters, ultimately the investors, will own VPSA's $50 million bond. VPSA will own each locality's $10 million local bond. And VPSA will receive the $50 million from the underwriters and passes all that along to the localities for their projects. There are a few more things involved between those bullets, but that is the gist of how the process works. So how do we make it work? As I said, the locality pays no upfront fee to VPSA, no other costs of issuance beyond their opinion of council. The way we do this is VPSA charges a 5 basis point or 0.05% surcharge on the interest rate of the local GO bonds. Again, being very simplified here, but if VPSA sells its bond for 3%, the locality will pay 3.05% in interest on its bond. When we receive the 3.05 from the locality, the 3% portion is passed along to VPSA's bondholders. The 5 basis point portion is kept by VPSA. Very slowly, that 5 basis point amount will reimburse us for the actual cost of issuance of the bonds, which are quite a few. Bond ratings, bond counsel fee, our financial advisor who structures all this, all the other out-of-pocket costs, VPSA pays up front and then is reimbursed over time from that 5 basis point surcharge on the local interest. I should also add that pays for our operating expenses as well. Very quickly, several members of the General Assembly in here, so I think this is important to point out. Part of the reason we get the ratings we do and the favorable rates we do are the security features for the bondholders who purchase VPSA's bonds. You see it here in pyramid form. The base of that is the general obligation pledge of the localities because they have sold a GO bond pledging their full faith and credit to VPSA. Important to note that no locality in Virginia has ever defaulted on a GO pledge. We do have a secondary piece of security there, the state aid intercept mechanism. All sorts of funds flow from the state level to the local level. Should a locality ever not make good on its GO pledge, we do have the ability to intercept the amount needed from those funds that are flowing from state to local. And even a final security feature, some sufficient appropriation. Each year in the budget is included language that says, should a locality not make good on its general obligation pledge, should there not be sufficient amounts through state aid intercept, then there is appropriated a sum sufficient to make up that difference. So 3 levels of security to ensure that the bondholders are repaid, and thankfully we have never even had to go to the second level. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the literary fund, but Madam Chair, I don't know if you want to stop on the VPSA portion to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, are there any questions on the VPSA? Yes, Delegate Simons.
So what about a locality that has already reached kind of its debt capacity that wants to go and do $50 million for a school? Are you able to work with them? And then also, this all goes through the locality, right? Like the school board can't come to you and say that. Those are my questions.
Right. A couple things there. First of all, when a locality applies to VPSA, it requires a resolution from both the school board and the local governing body to do that. Second of all, I asked you at the beginning to keep in mind low-cost financing, those words. This is financing. When I'm going to talk about the literary fund in a moment, again, financing, borrowing, debt. It requires the locality to make a pledge to repay that debt. If you are a city who is at or near your debt limit, unfortunately, not a lot we can do about that because you couldn't make that pledge. If you are a county who, for whatever reason, be it economic, political, otherwise, is not in a position to raise the revenue to pay the debt service on this bond you're issuing to VPSA, again, no bond issued to us. We're unable to assist in that regard. As I mentioned, there are a lot of localities in Virginia that we have assisted with very favorable borrowing terms, but again, you have to be in a position to be able to borrow.
Any other questions on this portion? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So literary fund, very quickly here. If you're not familiar with it, created in the Constitution of Virginia, I think in 1810. Permanent perpetual fund for public school purposes, required to maintain a minimum balance of $80 million, and amounts above that amount can be used for other school purposes. I'm going to talk in a second about loans to school divisions from literary funds. It's important to note that those loans, just as a bank considers loans assets, the literary fund considers loans made from the fund as assets. In other words, they count toward that $80 million balance. The literary fund, it receives amounts from unclaimed property, fines, fees, and forfeitures, unclaimed lottery proceeds, interest earnings on all of that. And what it does is make disbursements for literary fund loans. They're in many ways very similar to what VPSA does. It's just directly from the literary fund to the locality. The locality still makes a pledge to repay the literary fund loan. Those amounts are currently limited to $7.5 million per project. Also, the literary fund makes payments. If you're familiar, the Appropriation Act, I think each of the last 9 years has included school technology and security notes, providing VPSA issues these short-term 5-year notes to provide funds for the DOE uses to provide grants to school divisions for technology and security needs. The debt service, the repayment of principal and interest on those comes from the literary fund. And of course, transfers are made from the literary fund for teacher retirement and Social Security. Right now, 32 localities have loans outstanding under the literary fund, about $65 million total. And these last two bullets sort of lead into why we're bringing this up here. The 65 million figure, assuming normal payoffs and so forth, is expected to decrease by about 43% in the next 5 years. The other point I want to make is the percentage of literary fund revenues that are used for teacher retirement. 1981 to 2008, it averaged about 47% of the literary fund revenues. Since the financial crisis, over 72%. So the amounts available for making literary fund loans have been reduced a bit over that time. So along these lines, in the past, most recent Appropriation Act, Department of Education, Department of Treasury were jointly tasked with developing recommendations to make literary fund more competitive and attractive to school divisions, and also increase the fiscal health of the literary fund. And DOE and Treasury provided this report at the end of July of this year to the governor and to chairs within the General Assembly. There are 6 recommendations listed up there. I'll just very quickly go with them. Again, this was jointly between DOE and Treasury. And sort of in decreasing order of priority, these are the things that we think would most accomplish the 2 directives we were given. First, to prioritize and increase construction loans. The amounts, as I shown, used for other purposes beyond loans have increased greatly in recent times. So decreasing the use of funds for those purposes and directing them toward loans would go a long way. The minimum asset base of 80 million. You heard descriptions in earlier presentations about the cost of schools and renovations and so forth. We think that 80 million probably could stand to be updated, and we recommended 250 million.
That's a one school, 80 million.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And along those lines, again, the maximum loan amount of 7.5 million. There are certainly very much needed projects that could be accomplished with that, but it is a bit of a shortfall for other things. And 7.5 out of 80, you see where we get pretty quickly. So we did recommend raising that maximum loan amount to 25 million. Third bullet there, lower literary fund rate range, prioritize using the local composite index, and conduct an annual application process. Literary fund rate range is in the code. It ranges from 2 to 6%. And what rate a locality gets is based on their local composite index, the LCI, ability to repay. You can imagine lots of 6% in Northern Virginia. As you go south, you move toward more 2%. So we recommend lowering those rate ranges from the 2 to 6% range. We made a recommendation of fixing them at 1 to 3, although we would also consider favorable just benchmarking them to the market. 2.6, 2 to 6, sometimes it's good, sometimes not so much. Prioritize using the LCI. When projects are presented for a literary fund loan, those localities with the lowest LCI would get priority, so the funds would go where they're most needed. And an annual application process, that would of course be needed if we had a variable rate that was benchmarked at a certain point. But also it would lead into the next bullet point, remove inactive projects from the waiting list. I think there are 5 projects right now on the first priority waiting list, and the oldest are from 2008, I believe. Not questioning at all the validity or the need for these projects, but just if you can imagine a school division considering the literary fund loan and looking at the waiting list and seeing that there are things that have been on there since 2008, they may not be inclined to even pursue it, although it could be a good option for them. So the annual application process and the removal of inactive projects after a period of time is something we would recommend.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
May I ask a question about the inactive projects that are on the wait list? I've not looked at it since before the pandemic, but I did know that they're not only on the priority wait list, but there's a secondary list as well. And I know that some of those projects have either already been completed through different financing. What is the reason that those projects remain on that wait list? Is it just that the divisions don't pull it off?
I'll look to Mr. Dickey maybe for some added color, but I will say I believe that the first priority waiting list has been whittled down. Certainly some of those projects actually were funded through VPSA spooled bond program. And those particular projects have been removed from the list.
Madam Chair, in response to your question, those are inactive projects where locally the school board and the local government have been in the decision-making process for a number of years, whether to continue with the project as proposed, which are typically large-scale renovations of very large, very old buildings, or regroup and total, go to a total replacement project. And we periodically check with the school divisions on the status of those projects, whether they want to proceed with those projects. But it's typically a local decision-making process that in many cases has moved slowly on whether to renovate or build anew. The other issue is simply at this point in time with changeover locally in boards, approval for the additional loan debt in the locality. That's a secondary factor.
The other question I have is, you mentioned there's $65 million in outstanding loans currently in the literary fund. How many of those are relatively new loans?
Depending on the definition of relatively, I'd say very few. Again, I think, maybe 5 or 6 approved in most of the last decade. Am I correct on that?
Approximately yesterday.
Yeah.
Could you
Which
repeat
leads
that?
to
Wait,
the-
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that in the microphone?
I
for
apologize.
everybody here?
In most of the last decade, I'd say 5 or 6 loans have come on in that time. So most of them are, and that's why the reduction, the quick reduction is coming, because most of those are older and will be soon paying off.
Which leads to maybe a question or suggestion for the commission. If folks aren't using the literary fund for that purpose, is there a better way for Virginia to provide those funds to school divisions, whether it be through a grant program or something different?
I think that is something worth our discussion at our December meeting, and ask Ryan to have that as one of the recommendations we discuss. Yes, Dr. Lane?
I think that's the purpose for the 6 recommendations.
Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Dan.
One thing I would just point out, and I don't know if you were going to get to this or not, but parallel to this, out of the literary fund, there's also been what we call interest rate subsidy programs, where we use projects that are on the approved literary fund application list, and we use the money from the literary fund to actually buy down the market interest rate to the literary fund loan rate. And so many projects that have come in have not been funded through loans, because I don't remember how in the last 10 years how many subsidy programs there were, but I think there were a couple.
2008, I believe, was the
2008
last.
was the last
Yes.
time we had a subsidy program?
Yes.
Well, I just point that out because that was a tool at one point in time that was used to manage the volume of the applications on the literary fund waiting list. And it's an effective way to get it off. The difference between it and the literary fund loan is that the money is not recycled, because the money is spent on debt.
Okay.
It is not it's not recycled back to the literary fund as a loan would be. But I didn't know if that was something you were going to get to. But I didn't realize it had been since 2008 since we've done a subsidy, though.
Yeah, that's right. It is not on this list. Again, we sort of had a twofold purpose we were given here to make literary fund more competitive and attractive, and also to increase the fiscal health of the fund. The subsidy program certainly takes care of the first. It does provide funds to localities for their needs, but being a grant rather than a loan, it does not contribute to that asset base. So every dollar that goes out stays out. And I did not mention the revenues of the fund, but things like fines and forfeitures have been decreasing. So funds in as well have been a challenge.
Any further questions? Senator McPike? Oh, no, okay.
Madam Chair, I would just wanted to emphasize just the last couple of questions. One of the things that keeps us from our understanding from making loans to local government, especially in this last decade, the rates in the bond market have been so low. For example, we issued Prince William County bonds yesterday, 1.6%, something like that.
county, which AAA got 1.6, as I said, 1.8 for borrowing in our spring pool, which is lower, again, than the lowest literary fund.
So the spring borrowing, spring VPSA borrowing for, all the applicants that were part of that pool, the rate was 1.8% for 20-year bond.
20 years.
And yesterday, Prince William County, which is a AAA rated county, issued standalone bonds, their own bonds without being in a pool, through VPSA 1.6%. So with the rates being so low, the problem is the current range that can be charged for literary fund loans is in the Code of Virginia, and it says 2% to 6%. It's not beneficial for these counties and cities to come to us for that. That's why rate subsidy or loan, and one of the recommendations is to either temporarily override that through Appropriation Act language until DOE is able to, put forward a piece of legislation to change that. It should not be in the code. Those things need to vary with the market, right?
Right, and I think the main purpose of, well, I don't know if this was your purpose, but my purpose for why this is in here, while the General Assembly, through this Appropriations Act, asked for recommendations on how to make the specific requests for recommendations related to the literary fund, we may want to use this report to make additional recommendations as a commission to serve our purposes. So I think this discussion is very helpful, and at our December meeting, I think we should specifically discuss what, if any, recommendations this commission should make for changes to the literary fund. I think either benchmarking or overriding that interest loan rate restriction might be one. Some of these off of this recommendation letter might also be helpful as well. And I'll ask the members between now and December to sort of think about other recommendations we received, and I was going to go over this sort of in the discussion, but at our first meeting, I believe in April, we received an overview of legislation proposed that had not passed, in addition to legislation proposed that did pass related to school construction and renovation, and several of those bills that did not pass involved the literary fund. So I think those are all ripe for us to look at and consider whether to make specific recommendations in 2022. But I also remind everybody, this commission is not scheduled to sunset until 2026. We are not going to solve this problem in the 2022 session. So I just put all that out there as food for thought for both today and December. Any other? If not, thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, the one other question, though, is you mentioned localities that don't have debt capacity, and there are other opportunities out there for financing, whether it's through a private-public partnership and the PPA process through Virginia. Do you have information on those other opportunities that you could share with the commission between now and December?
Absolutely. That is something again, what you saw today was somewhat based on what I present to local governments and school divisions, and there are other options, and generally the reason they're not there is I have not seen them used enough to have a good idea on it. I'm aware of the public-private partnerships you're mentioning. Dickinson County, I believe, used a USDA rural development program. I'm not aware that if any other school division in the Commonwealth has, but again, I would love to be able to get more information on those, not just for this commission, but when I am talking to localities, to give them all the options available.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So the last part of our agenda is sort of a discussion for what we're going to do at the December meeting. Looking back through our meeting notes and the questions that have been asked by the commission, I think there are a few outstanding questions that we should talk about or have an answer to by the next meeting if possible. And there and one I'm going to add. So we asked whether the Cannabis Equity Reinvestment Fund that was in the marijuana legalization bill that passed could be accessible for school construction and modernization, and whether anything in the reenactment clauses would limit that, or if that's something we need to pursue going forward. I would add to that, among the bills that passed that did have some relationship to school construction was the casino bill. Did include some language around casino funds that, if not otherwise appropriated, or that could be used for school construction if appropriated. I think a question related to that is, when is the earliest opportunity those funds would be available for appropriation, considering that licenses aren't expected until, and Senator McPike can probably correct me if I'm wrong, licenses probably won't be issued until April of 2022. And those casinos probably won't be opened until much later than that. So, but is that in already existing code potential source going forward? We asked if there was a connection between high fiscal stress and low composite index school divisions and each of the new capital projects. I don't believe we have received that answer yet. We asked, can existing historic rehabilitation tax credits be used to promote school renovation? I believe the answer is no, but and if anyone in the audience can answer these questions now, I believe the answer to that is no. But if
Madam Chair, I mean, I think you'd have to go through the P3 process to leverage some of the historic credits in terms of selling the school asset, leasing back. There's other mechanisms that are out there. It's just there's a couple more hoops to get there.
Okay, so if we could get some clarity on that. And then we asked for a review of how other states, if other states at the state level, and how they fund school construction, and then related, whether any states interpreted the permissible uses of ESSER funds and ARPA funds differently from the way that we did. So I think that would be information we still need to receive, and if we could get that at the December meeting, or at least an indication of when we could, that would be helpful. And then finally, and I will email this back around to all of the members, but I alluded to it. At our April meeting, we got an overview of legislation since 2018 that had been, that either passed or failed. And I think that is a logical first step, is for us to look at that already written legislation that had failed to see, is there anything there we would want to revive for the 2022 session. So Ryan, if you could email that, the notes with that list to the commission members, and then I'll ask the commission members, I'd say by, probably by the end of October, if you could identify any bills that you specifically would like to discuss as a proposal at the December meeting. And then finally, I guess one question that I have, and maybe this is for House Appropriations or Senate Finance staff. I believe that the federal infrastructure bill that passed the U.S. Senate did not have funding related to school construction and modernization, but there might have been some discussion in the federal reconciliation bill, which is still ongoing. Do you know whether school construction funds are at least being discussed as part of that reconciliation process?
Yes, Senator McCollum, Tyler Williams, Senate Finance and Appropriations. The House Education and Labor Committee, the U.S. House, is exploring school construction in their reconciliation instructions from the U.S. Senate. Okay. And I believe what passed out of that committee a few weeks ago included school construction.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, it does include 82 billion, but it looks like if it's not on the cutting floor, it's at least on the chopping block.
Okay. All right. So those are sort of unfinished business. I know we will need to discuss as part of our December meeting. Are there any other either questions members have or proposals they would like for us to discuss at the December meeting? Senator McPike.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think Mr. Gecker's question in terms of
Yes.
the reinvestment of capital ratio and what we see in terms of schools actually investing in capital. I know some are a non-number of zero, and there are some with greater capital investment rates. And I think that's important in consideration of what a locality's level of effort is and towards maintaining that asset. And I think that's very important, sort of one of the fundamental questions of this committee as it applies. As a second one, I'd also hopefully draw some better expertise, maybe from those that are here, or maybe some outside experts in terms of the influence of local referendum authority between cities and counties and how that influences issuance of debt decisions across the Commonwealth. I think those are two pretty fundamental decisions of influence, both politically as well as the sort of structure.
Okay. Yes, Delegate Simon.
So one piece of legislation from last year that I would like to explore is the additional local sales tax in certain localities, use of revenues for construction or renovation of schools, the school construction tax, if we could talk about that in December.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, well, under the legislation that established this commission, we are required, I don't know, I'm actually looking for it, the exact language. We are required to provide, and there's not a date, sort of an annual summary of our work, but then we are required by the first day of, yeah, there it is. By the first day of the regular session, we must submit an executive summary of the interim activity and work of the commission for publication as a report. So I would like to have as much of that report draft available for the commission to review and approve at our December 1st meeting. And I think at this point, we know what will be in that report is a summary as identified, including the additional information Dr. Lane will provide, a summary of the identified needs that are both included in approved capital improvement plans and in the needs we know exist but have not been approved in capital improvement plans, a summary of, by division, a summary of funding that has already been provided through the ARPA funding or through state and, local uses of ARPA funds to the extent that's already been had. I guess we haven't talked about that yet. The local governments are still, they have not used their ARPA funds yet, have they?
They've not made final decisions on all of it, local governments. Some of it has been decided, but maybe not begun reimbursement.
Okay, so maybe at the December meeting, to the extent decisions have been made, if we could have a summary of that.
And Senator, some of the questions you're asking don't come from the school boards. And so we've discussed many of the requests with legislative staff, and some of the lists that you read earlier, they're still compiling, but
yeah,
we've provided what we can.
I understand that. No hard deadline on these, just sort of as we get it, as quickly as we can digest it and make use of it, but recognizing this is not going to be done by January. So what are the needs we've identified? What needs have already been paid for, or at least are in the process of being paid for? And I'm high level summarizing now. If we could have in the report that a list of legislation since 2018, a summary of that, and then at the December meeting, we will at least approve that portion of the report, and then we will discuss what, if any, recommendations we want to make for the 2022 session, and what additional work we want to do in the interim in 2022. That is an ambitious agenda, but at a minimum, if we can approve the report and decide on any recommendations, that's good enough for me, at least for the December meeting, and then we will continue after session. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, Senator, just so I'm clear,
Yes.
I think what you're saying is, so the decision is more financing is needed or more funds are needed. Have you reached some conclusion as to whether that takes the form of additional sources of financing or a change sort of in how the state funds capital, which right now is virtually, zero, compared to the localities? Is that decision, is that going to be talked about?
We will begin that specific discussion in December.
Okay.
And if there are identifiable recommendations we can make for the 2022 session, recognizing that bill drafting deadlines will be probably the same week we're meeting, we will make them. But that is going to be a longer term discussion that will not be completed in time for the 2022 session. But we will have it and begin it.
I just want to make sure I didn't miss that decision.
Yeah, no, you will definitely be a part of that. And I believe, Ryan, have we set that meeting date?
Oh, yes, Madam Chair. It's going to be December 1st at 10 a.m. in this room.
Okay. And Ryan, do you know, or off the top of your head, what the bill drafting deadline for 2022 is for pre-filing?
Yes, Madam Chair. It's actually a little bit earlier this year, so I think it's 2 days before that meeting. But what Stephen and I can do is just open up a bunch of placeholders for the commission, and then we can fill them in after that date.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, if there are no further questions or comments, I want to thank everyone. Has been a pleasure to see you in person. Hopefully our next meeting will also be in person. So in the meantime, please stay safe and have a great couple of months.